Hello everyone. On behalf of the Victorian team at the Institute of Architects, I'd like to offer you a warm welcome to today's lean-in, Renewing the Past, Embracing Adaptive Reuse for Sustainable Futures. In addressing the challenge of embodied carbon, materials, energy and economic resources in our built environment, there's a pressing need for our profession to shift focus towards the value already embedded in existing buildings. My name is Stephanie Bullock and I'm from Kozloff Architecture and sit on the Institute's Victorian Chapter Council, and it's my honour to be your host and moderator for today's lean-in session. We're joining from across the country today and we acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this land. We acknowledge that it is a privilege to stand on country and walk in the footsteps of those before us, and we pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging. The lean-in session is being recorded, so if you miss anything today or have to leave early, we'll be publishing this recording on the Institute's YouTube channel in the next couple of days, and we'll share that link with you in our upcoming email communications. This lean-in session enables you to ask questions of our panellists, so if you have a question or comment, please use the Q&A box down below to add yours in, and we'll go through these later in the session. Ed Daines is the Director of WilkinsonEyre Australia, playing an essential role in many of the practices projects in the region, with over 20 years of experience designing and delivering high-quality UK and international projects across a variety of sectors. His portfolio also includes work on Battersea Power Station in the UK and a range of infrastructure and master planning projects. In today's lean-in, Ed will explore restoration and adaptive reuse projects by his firm, WilkinsonEyre, Battersea Power Station, Weston Library and 63 Madison Avenue, which are all prime examples of how we can use and renew the materials, energy and carbon previously invested. Thank you, Ed.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie, for that introduction. Hopefully you're seeing my screen and hearing me okay. Let's do that.
Perfect. Thanks, Ed.
Good start. Okay, well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Hopefully you can also see my lovely visage on the camera as well. So yes, just to reiterate a little bit, my name is Ed Daines, Director of WilkinsonEyre Architects, heading up our studio here in Australia. The practice WilkinsonEyre was founded in the UK originally and is a little over 40 years old. So I was very much brought on at half-time, having only been a part of the practice for the last 20 years. I'm now permanently based here in Australia with my family and very much enjoying the dynamic architectural and construction scene here in this country. Let me just see if the slide will progress. Excellent. So I was invited to do this talk following a talk I gave in Melbourne on what the facade of the future might look like. You know, increasingly we're being asked to reuse and repurpose existing buildings, and this slide is from that talk. And really shows 4 of our practices recently completed projects, and it sort of gives away the punchline in a degree, as in my view there is not and can never be any one answer, and neither should there be. And we're quite proud at sort of WilkinsonEyre that we don't particularly have a house style as such. We have a house process, attention to detail, love of materials, and the possibilities sort of afforded by the latest technology and synergy with good engineers. But we do aim to embark on every project with an open mind, no preconceived ideas about what that project might look like at the outset, which we achieve to a greater or lesser extent depending on the project. It means that over the years we've often been approached to look at difficult problems, interesting challenges, and this is often and is increasingly including adapting of existing buildings or structures. So this is a quote. I'm not even sure if it's a true quote. I think it's ascribed to Carl Elefanti, if I'm right, but it is something coming across increasingly, that the greenest building is the one you're in. And that really is reflective of the shifting narrative towards the importance of reuse. Now, it's not always an operational carbon truth, to be told. It also sort of does rather put aside issues where buildings are genuinely obsolescent. They don't have the right access requirements, fire requirements, or operational carbon requirements, and also densification of our cities, which is sustainable in its own right, often overrides this. So although it's not as simple, I think the truth is more that the greenest building could be the one that you're in. And the reality that we're facing increasingly is that the greenest building could be the one you're in, and if not, prove it. Certainly for our colleagues in the UK, you know, we are now in a situation, certainly within London, where you absolutely have to demonstrate beyond doubt that the only way to proceed on a given site is to demolish it, should that be the route your client wishes to go. And it's becoming an increasingly high hurdle to jump over. So it is becoming a given increasingly. And the narrative here is no different, as you'll all be aware. This is just one document, guidelines for the adaptive reuse of office buildings from September from the City of Melbourne. But there are other conversations happening in all the cities and states across Australia about the importance of reuse of the existing built fabric. The conversation, in short, is only going one way, is likely to become a retrofit first. A little bit of our back catalogue. I promise I won't spend too long on this, but it is something that as a practice we have had a long tradition of doing. This is a project called Magna in the UK, one of the old abandoned sort of Sheffield steel mills up in the north of England that we repurposed with an absolute shoestring budget to tell the story of the steelmaking process. The budget here, I believe I was told by a colleague, didn't even cover the finishing of the floor within this space. So the installation or the intervention from our part became a series of separate floating lightweight pavilions within the structure, sort of telling the story of the processes that were happening in what was effectively the ruin below. So a bit of feature lighting and some lightweight pavilions to really tell the story and let the romance of the ruin, if you like, do all of the talking. We actually won the Sterling Prize for this in 2001. So this was a very big sort of threshold moment for us, over 20 years ago now. Similarly, in 2003, this was a 1960s office building in West London, fairly unloved building out in Earl's Court. It had limited floor-to-floor heights. The MEP was failing, the lifting was inadequate, the facades were failing, but the building wanted to be retained. So we did a whole scheme where the whole structure was retained, a complete internal refit, reclad. The facade on the south there, which you see on the image of the right, was extended by 4 meters to give increased floor areas. Additional 4 stories were put on top with a sort of a lightweight steel extension, etc. And the building was given a whole new lease of life, without demolishing it and going back to its and starting again in effect. And that was largely because there was no way a tall building was going to be achieved again on this site. It was rather remarkable that it was achieved in the first place in the 1960s. And our sort of catalogue has included, I'm going to call it the weird and the wonderful. So these were sort of some heritage listed Victorian gas holder structures in the King's Cross area, again in central London here. And again, we won a competition earlier than 2018, actually, but as part of the master plan to redevelop that area, we won the competition to restore and convert these gas holders and integrate new residential components inside there. One that sort of respected the original structure, but at the same time had a sort of a poetry and an architectural language that spoke to the history of the structures. You can see the cladding there on the right, very much redolent of the idea of these old gas balloons sort of floating and sinking as they used to do as the gas levels inside varied. And it's something that we're very much involved in today. These are 2 projects which are on our books currently back in the UK as well. So the rather wonderful building on the left, let's just say it divides opinions, postmodernist at its finest. Minster Court, as it's known, Munster Court in the City of London. We're currently working on redeveloping that and reusing that. And again, it involves reusing as much of the existing structure as possible. But the aim is to give it an entirely new look despite that. And the project on the right for Citibank out of Canary Wharf, where we're completely reworking the interiors of the tower, but leaving the structure and the majority of the cladding in place to provide new workspace environments that the bank believes it requires in the brave post-COVID world. So this is very much an ongoing thing that we're confronting ourselves with. Now, the projects I'm going to talk to today, it says here the facade of the future, because this was the genesis of this talk. But there are 3 projects here that I thought were worthwhile dealing with. The one on the left there is the Weston Library, known at the time as the New Bodleian Library, the University of Oxford. It was a heritage protected building in a very, very sensitive setting, but for reasons that I will explain and expand upon, was no longer effectively fit for purpose. The project in the middle, Battersea Power Station, in many ways, the kind of the Everest of sort of heritage restoration, was again a much loved and an iconic building that was in an absolute dire state and was of a scale that had broken many people, many contractors and developers that had approached it. And people really were scratching their heads with it, and it had been filed in the too hard column for a long time. And again, we were involved in bringing that back to life. And then the project on the right is very deliberately included because it's not a heritage building. It's a fairly unloved building in Madison Avenue in New York, where we won a competition to establish a strategy by which even those unloved buildings could be brought back to life in a in a fun and poetic way in the most unlikely of circumstances. So those are the three which I was going to pass through today to hopefully provide a little bit of food for thought. So the first of those three is the Weston Library, now known after a generous donation by the Canadian Weston family, at the time known as the new Bodleian Library as part of Oxford University. We won the competition to redevelop this in 2006. I was involved in the competition itself. And the building was Grade 2 listed. It was designed by Sir Giles Gilbert Scott in the 1930s and completed in the 1940s, so actually right in the middle of the Second World War. And the building itself, seen on the bottom here in this image, was part of a really amazing context and collection of buildings. You don't get many urban contexts like this, certainly in the UK or even in many European cities. But you know, it's kind of a who's who of architecture going back through the ages. So at the bottom there, you've got the new Bodleian Library by Gilbert Scott, and then the building immediately opposite. If I get any of these wrong, please don't criticise me. But I believe you have the Clarendon, which was by Hawksmoor in 1715. The building at the back, the circular one there, is the Radcliffe Camera by James Gibbs. And the building in the middle, the one with the courtyard and the little tower on the left-hand side, is the Duke Humphreys Library and the Tower of the Five Orders, the rather fantastically named Tower of the Five Orders, so named because of the series of column and architectural orders that are present on the tower itself. And components of that building date back to the 1450s, I believe, the Duke Humphreys Library contained within. And until 1753, the Bodleian Library was effectively the National Library of England, at which point it was taken over by its London equivalent. And so the collection of manuscripts and documents and material inside there is nothing short of remarkable. The spaces inside are also pretty remarkable. As places go to sit and read a book, you'd be hard beaten to top these. I had the honor of doing a competition of being shown around all these spaces and really being exploring. And even I felt somewhat smarter just for the just for the ability to be there and be in the presence of these amazing books and spaces. You can get in and do a private tour of these buildings, but it has a number of famous occupants. That means you may have already actually seen inside those buildings there. So the Duke Humphreys Library is, for those who are interested in cultural references, is actually used as the library in Hogwarts. So there you are. You may have already explored it unknowingly. The collection itself is also pretty remarkable. There's over 1 million categorized special collection items. There are rare books, as I say, maps, ancient manuscripts. Some of those include copies of the Gutenberg Bible. There are various Anglo-Saxon chronicles within there. A copy of Shakespeare's First Folio, that's probably worth a bobble too. And one of my particular favorites, you know, sort of initial handwritten drafts of The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien. Some really quite remarkable artifacts. And they carry out a lot of work in restoring, preserving these documents, and providing scholarly access to study these documents as well. So there's a lot of work goes on within the library. It's not just a storage thing. Although some of the images at the top there start to hint that they were starting to have real difficulties storing this ever-growing collection. So a little word about Giles Gilbert Scott, who was the architect of the new Bodleian Library. He was already at that time an architect of some renown. He was president of the RIBA in the UK at that time, I believe. And his approach was very much about looking for an architecture that combined the best elements of a contextual tradition with the growing trend for the fresh approach of modernism. So he was not averse to the new things that modernism brought to the party, but you know, he would often be known to plea for a sort of a, you know, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And some of his iconic designs include the red telephone boxes in London, for example, the Cambridge the Cambridge University Library, sorry, at the top in the middle there. And of course, Battersea Power Station itself down in the bottom right-hand corner, of which a little bit more later. So his design for the new Bodleian Library was for an 11-storey building on Broad Street in Oxford. Effectively, it was a central book stack, which you can see bulging out of the top there, surrounded by a ring of administrative offices, reading rooms, etc. And it gave what was sort of what seems now as a very polite masonry stone facade to the rest of Oxford that belied actually the interiors that were going on inside. It was not universally loved at the time, I think it's fair to say. I found a quote from the Architects' Journal in 1940 that said, "The Bodleian Library was once a place of scholarly beauty, but the new building feels more like a bureaucratic institution than the beating heart of a university." which I always personally felt was slightly unfair. I think it's aged rather better than that, but I do find encouragement in the fact that Architectural Journal was still finding itself able to be sniffy about new buildings in 1940, when you would have thought there were other things to worry about. So yes, this building was completed right in the middle of the Second World War. Now, the external politeness actually marked quite a lot of internal innovation. So the book stack was exactly that. It was an 11-story high bookshelf, effectively, of steel structure constructed of back-to-back steel angles. Effectively, the structure were the verticals of the bookshelves, with very thin concrete slabs separating the various floors. This had rather the endearing property of providing absolutely no fire protection. There was no fire protection to the existing stack structure. There was no means of preventing a fire from spreading within the building. And there was also no effective means of suppressing a fire once it had started. And that was still the case when we got involved with the project. This was then, of course, filled with absolutely priceless, irreplaceable, and highly flammable documents in the middle of the Second World War. What could possibly go wrong? Fortunately, for some reason, even the Germans in the Second World War felt that Oxford and the university itself was too important to damage, so somehow it survived the Second World War and its collections intact. But nevertheless, it was clear by the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st, that the situation could not continue. There was a new facility built out on the edge of Oxford to contain a large amount of the collection. It could be moved out and stored in there, and so work could begin on rebuilding and restoring the new Bodleian Library. It was a heritage building. It was Grade 2 listed, but it was full. It was inaccessible to the public, inaccessible to those with disabilities. It was environmentally failing. The documents would go from a relatively well environmentally controlled central book stack and then go to reading rooms which had varying humidity and temperature levels, which made it very less than ideal for some of the more delicate documents contained within. And as I mentioned before, it was basically dangerous. Something needed to be done. It couldn't continue. Externally, the building also had problems. This here is the main facade onto Broad Street. What in every aspect of its urban context tells you should be the main entrance of the building had no means of access to it. The access to the building was actually through a door to the side, on the side street, just past that little pink house on the corner there. The ceremonial door on the, just see lurking there on the right with the big sort of stone edifice over the top of it. The door there was permanently locked after the key broke in the lock during the opening ceremony. So everybody, academics, visitors, etc., had to go around the side door where a small reception desk lets you in. All that was on this main front of the building, inverted commas, was a raised plinth next to which university students would regularly chain their bikes. Less than ideal as well. So these plans talk a little bit about what the strategy for the building was. On the left there, you see a diagram of the existing building, the purple being the book stack in plan and section. You can see the effectively square plan with the book stack wrapped in the center, wrapped by a series of reading rooms and administrative offices around the edge in grey. And those spaces, a lot of those had a lot of sort of beautiful architectural moments that needed conservation and restoration. So they were designated and identified as being the most significant areas from a heritage point of view. But the building on the right really tells probably the full scary truth of the story, that the extent of the building that was going to need to be demolished come what may was quite substantial. The entire book stack effectively had to come down whilst restoring and preserving the facades around the edge and doing what we could to improve the environmental characteristics of the buildings while we were at it. So the little sketch diagram that shows the main moves. The idea was then, so south is now to the left of the page, the main entrance there was to open up that main entrance, make it accessible to the public and really allow the public to come fully into the building at ground floor level. Book storage in the basement would be brought up to standard, and an additional book stack would be raised above the head of visitors and expressed in an architectural way and form an inner sanctum of highly environmentally and secure controlled area for the storage of the more precious items, again surrounded by the restored reading rooms and various administrative offices that were there. At ground level as well, it was a chance to introduce exhibition spaces, lecture theatres, so some of the more precious collections could be displayed and explained to members of the public so that people could get an insight of what was held there, what went on. And there are some fantastic events that get held there periodically through the year. But generally speaking, the idea was that this was going to be a central quad in effect and publicly accessible as much as possible. And that's very much in the tradition of Oxford. This is a sketch I painfully did at the time, marking out all of the nearby quads in Oxford. And it really is an urban tradition that quite unique to Oxford, of having this sort of central quad or lawn that forms the heart of the college within the wider university framework. Not that you're often allowed to walk on them, of course. The entrance itself, in order to make it accessible and to deal with the level change, we're making that obviously it had to be had to have ramp access, had to provide access for all individuals, and the original concept was really to open up the full width of those bay windows along ground level there, turn them into a colonnade, and really express the fact that this was a publicly accessible building and you're welcome to come in and sign a real entrance that the building deserved. Just some shots here of some of the external fabric. It was generally in pretty good nick, to be honest. There was a lot of stuff there that was worth preserving. A strategy was come up with to do the absolute minimum in restoring it. Only repointing where absolutely necessary. Generally speaking, it was a cleanup and a renovation. The roof had some work done a few decades before, where some insulation had been provided. The strategy was to replace much of the roof anyway. It was inevitable to do with given the extent of the demolition. But nevertheless, it was in reasonable condition, notwithstanding. The windows as well, although they were 70 years old at that point, were also in pretty good condition, and generally they were left as were, with the addition only of an additional solar control coating to the glass to slightly improve its performance. Internally, and I'll show you some more images of this later on, there were some really lovely spaces and lovely moments inside the buildings of lovely sort of 1930s and 1940s stonework, ironwork, and some really quite impressive timber marquetry ceilings as well. And again, as much as possible, it was a light touch. It was a restoration, careful painstaking restoration of that, and more careful integration of new services without affecting or damaging the original. So we submitted planning and won planning in 2010. And, after a long conversation with all the various heritage bodies that were involved, and we were underway. So to sort of break down the building, if you like, to go through the main steps, you've got the internal structural steel that shows you exactly for the 1930s, 1940s, what a modern concept it was. This was the book stack. Effectively, it was a bookshelf wrapped to make it look like a building. Once the wrapping was on, this was just prior to its completion in 1940, you can see what a polite, urbane building it is. It gives no sort of clue of the structural delights / horrors that lie within. The state of the building when we inherited it, the more eagle-eyed amongst you would have seen a rather lovely rooftop addition from the 1960s on the top, which was an additional reading room space. Not really visible from the street, but that's about all you could say for it. It was otherwise not in keeping with the architecture of the building. It froze in winter and it overheated in summer. So that was clearly going to go as well. You can also see the plinth there quite nicely from that angle, and that little sort of series of windows along the front there, for which we were aiming to convert into an entrance arcade, and the lovely connection of bicycles chained up against the plinth. So a render that we did as part of the application, showing those steps going in there, the roof extension being removed, and the new arcade being put into place. So I found this photo from the archives. I think this is possibly representative of the scariest moment. This does not immediately strike you as a painstaking restoration. So this is after removal of the book stack. You can see the sort of the higher 3 of the 4 elevations of the book stack being sort of retained and propped, whilst the steelwork is progressively removed inside. The external donut of supporting rooms you can just about make out are still preserved there. One of the facades of the book stack inevitably had to be demolished and rebuilt, as it was effectively supported on the steelwork that was so problematic. But I think it's fair to say at this point, for a sensitive heritage listed building, we've very much got the tiger by the tail at this point. And some photos of the final result. So this is a built image of it looking from Broad Street. You can see the arcade entrance from the steps with a suitably flattering number of students and visitors and members of the public sort of sitting on there, maybe meeting friends, etc. The door on the right with the access ramp, you can see that was the pre-existing entrance, and the newly exposed, as far as you can see it, book stack on the top there. Without it, the 1960s extension now sort of brought back to its original sort of symmetry and poise within the overall composition. You would never know that we'd been into the centre with such a heavy wrecking ball. A picture of the main entrance there and the ramp and the access steps. We like to think it feels like it was always meant to be there. It doesn't look, to my mind, as if it was ever meant to be anything other than an arcade. The entrance doors suitably secure, environmentally controlled, set back from the facade, and all of that can be achieved. And the inner public space underneath with the book stack raised above. So the timber-clad volume you see there on the left is the elevated book stack where the books are, the main book repository, the inner sanctum, as it were. And the new building, the new sort of walls on the right there are the back or the inner face of those external perimeter of rooms. And you can see the space underneath was really sort of opened up with various rooms for exhibitions and events within there. And some images of the sort of things that now surround that space. So we also designed a series of exhibition spaces for the various books and works you can see on the left there to be displayed. You get glimpses of the restoration and the archival roles that are taking place around. A new lecture theatre, new gallery space, etc., all provided. And I've been told, although I haven't tried, also excellent cakes are also provided by a small cafe there. That is clearly culturally of vital importance. There's also a sort of a real architectural drama that takes place. So the whole diagram effectively is because we were limited in what we could do for the performance of the heritage facade, the inner sanctum, by placing that volume within a volume, you ended up with these really quite interesting interstitial spaces. And we really played with the drama of that. So you go from the external reading rooms into the central storage, assuming you're permitted to do so, by these little glass bridges across these quite dramatic gaps within the building. And around the walls, these little sort of rather cute little sort of seating seating boxes are also provided to provide spaces to pause, linger, read a book, etc., very much in the tradition of the building. The perimeter rooms, yes, it really was an act of restoration. So you can see here the reading room on the left there. It has this remarkable sort of timber marquetry ceiling. And the job here really was to have as light a touch as possible. A new environmental control, air supply are actually integrated into the new bookshelves. A lot of the sort of furniture in there is new. It looks as if it's fairly timeless, but it does include sort of power sockets and phone charging points and all the things that a modern scholar requires, let's say. And various other spaces around the building where the work was really about, as light a touch as possible. And just a final image of that building, the new terrace that resulted and the view from it on the roof, just to give you an idea of the sensitivity of the context. So we like to think that to be able to take a wrecking ball to that building to the extent to which we did in that context was, we're really sort of happy with the achievement that was done there. And I think this is one of the finest views from the terrace you're likely to find. So having worked with the Gilbert Scott building, we got thrown an even bigger challenge for an even bigger Gilbert Scott building. So this is Battersea Power Station, which many of you may know from its architectural reputation or from its famous cover photo on the Pink Floyd album with the floating pig balloon. In 2012, we won the competition to redevelop Battersea Power Station. It was decommissioned at that time, but it was a protected heritage structure by the banks of the Thames in London. Interestingly, it had been built in two phases. The original phase was built in 1934 to the original Gilbert Scott design, and it was later then expanded after the Second World War in 1955, where effectively a mirror image of the original power station was then provided. The scale of this building is pretty remarkable. It's still the Sydney one. Sorry, I keep promising I'll do a comparison with the MCG to be more culturally sensitive to my Victorian colleagues. But nevertheless, this suffices, I think, to give an idea of the scale of it. And that effectively the main boiler house component of the power station would pretty much fit the Sydney Opera House inside it. It is a huge building. It was, I believe, the world's largest brick building when it was completed at the time in the 1930s. And it was controversial even in the 1930s as well, it should be said. As I said before, it was a game of two halves. So the 1930s, half of it was a turbine hall, and it was very much celebrating the age of heroic industry. I love the sculpture down the bottom there, the sort of muscular naked man making electricity. That's what you want in your workplace. But even the control rooms on the right were control rooms with the dials, but almost done like palaces with beautiful Art Deco glass ceilings above them. It really were sort of celebrating the spaces and the power of industry and the power of electricity production. The main turbine hall on the top left there seen in its rather dilapidated later state, but even then you can see some of the 1930s detailing, the faience tiling, the fluted columns that showed this real sort of pride and approach to the design. The second half, 1950s, this, let's just say, austerity Britain. Britain had run out of money. The nice glazed roof light that, you know, had the potential to guide in enemy bombers was gone. And this was very much an austerer, different type of architecture. The money had gone. And that, nonetheless, it's, to my mind, this has its own type of cool. So the control room in the top right-hand corner reminds me of, you know, the old Return to the Forbidden Planet films, or some sort of James Bond lair. You expect to see a captured submarine to be in the base of that turbine hall. So it had its own charm, you know, sort of minions in matching jumpsuits running around in electric buggies. It had its own sort of charm, but the two halves of the building very much spoke to the ages in which they were built and had remarkable architecture in their own right. Nevertheless, by the early 2000s, when we got to inherit it, to say it was in a mess doesn't quite sum it up. There have been various attempts to deal with the building since it was decommissioned in the 1980s, various ideas. There was a community housing bid. There was an idea for it at one point to become the new home for Chelsea Football Club, which would involve quite a lot of demolition. You know, some people like the idea of leaving it as a romantic ruin, ignoring the amount of asbestos, danger of collapse, and other toxic substances that were there. And the previous bid that got furthest was to turn it into a theme park. And that bid had actually got as far as demolishing the roof and, you know, large proportions of the external facade before effectively the developer went bust. They ran out of money, and the remaining structure was listed and protected. And another image there just showing the scale of it. Effectively, the roof had been left off for a number of years, and the whole structure had been left to the wind, the rain, and the pigeons. So what to do with a ruin that's in that state at that scale that you can't demolish? There was a master plan that was developed by Rafael Vignoli, and a series of Malaysian investors came on board in an attempt to grapple with the problem. It was a very dense master plan, and the master plan itself was quite controversial. But the basic truth of it was that the amount of residential was on there was to pay for the refurbishment of the power station, and the presence of the power station and its iconography is what gave value to the residential. So that was the very, very broad definition. This only worked really in the context of the entire master plan. And to sort of give you an idea of the amount of financial risk associated with the power station, the one sort of shift in budget that I like to sort of recount was that I think the original cost plan allowed, anecdotally, don't quote me on this, but I believe anecdotally allowed £200,000 for removal of remaining asbestos, having been assured that most of it had already been removed. That budget ended up being £40 million. So to say that that was a slight uplift is an understatement of fairly epic proportions. And similar acts of discovery were involved throughout the process. It really was a massively risky undertaking. So what went in the project? The building of that scale, a lot of different uses, retail at the bottom in green, event spaces above and within there. So cinema spaces, music recording studios, and just general event spaces. A new office component was above that, using up the volume of the boiler house. That was eventually taken by Apple to be their main headquarters. And the whole was wrapped, shown here in the purple, by new residential around the edges and up on the roof. The final element being a great glass Willy Wonka elevator going up one of the chimneys, which if you're ever there, I encourage you to take the ride. So we began the project by really a process of trying to understand what was there. And that included what I think was probably the biggest point cloud survey I've ever seen. Every time this thing was fired up, the lights in the office would dim. It was such a huge, huge file. And it really did go into the most inordinate detail. So every sort of material, junction, everything that was remained was recorded, and a decision made about what to do with every single space. And that really did set the tone for the thing going forwards. There was an ongoing conversation about what was to be kept, what was to be replaced, what could be repaired. If it was going to be replaced, did it look like the old thing, or did it look demonstrably new? And that was an ongoing dialogue that lasted about a decade. But really, to give you an idea of the detail of these images, I love the fire exit sign. You'll see the sort of the fire extinguisher in the middle there. They really are rather wonderful artistic things in their own right. So the environmental strategy for the building was therefore to deal with a series of zones that basically functioning around the different functions within. So the retail area was taken as a single zone. It was envisioned as an unconditioned space, effectively. So because it abutted a lot of the external fabric, that really sort of eased the requirements of getting good environmental controls on those areas. So this was a naturally ventilated space, very deep plan there, basically taking up the two main turbine halls, the 1930s and the 1950s space. And there's a whole ventilation strategy which engaged the large volume of those turbine halls and, enabled the air to be drawn through as much as possible by natural processes. Again, very early concept sketches, we were keen that as much as possible, you would still be able to perceive the volume of the existing building from the inside. So a lot of the volumes were pulled away from the facade, and that also had benefits as well for the environmental performance of the facades. So effectively, again, the same as we did in the bodily in the lesson learned, they are the inner sanctum. So environmentally controlled spaces could be achieved on an inner facade layer. So north and south end walls, for example, will be the skin to the arrival volumes, employing a light touch to those. Well, they were in quite a lot of a state, but we didn't want to necessarily give these too much polish. We thought that the ruination, wherever possible, was definitely part of the story. So again, where do you start with this? Again, working from the point cloud survey, these were no longer entirely vertical walls. They had variations, they had ripples, and finding a way to stabilize these in a permanent way. And the solution we came up with was a sort of a bowstring truss system, which was unapologetically modern, lightweight, engineered, so was going to stand in contrast to the existing fabric that would be retained. And here we see an image of how that looked in the final situation, which we think is a very dramatic and striking sort of entrance to the building, and really sort of makes you aware of the agenda of the building at the first entry point. And wherever possible, the ruination and the story of what was there before is told. You'll see the abandoned staircases, the removed floor slabs, still letting those stories be told on the inside. So looking at the 1930s turbine hall in the retail space as it was when we inherited and how it ended up. Some detail of some of the finishes inside there, and you'll see there the restoration of the faience tiles, some new, some restored, some replaced. The steelwork, as much as possible, the original condition was left, generally made safe. Some of it was replaced, some of it was kept. The roof trusses were generally kept, painted. Individual bolts had to be assessed as to whether they, again, could be restored, replaced on a bolt-by-bolt cases. It really was an epic process of going through every single connection and justifying every single act and every single detail. 1950s turbine hall, pretty similar. As it turned out now, things like the original gantry restored turned into what we call, this is actually still kept as a moving gantry and has a little what we call a bandstand suspended from it, which can be used for product launches, advertising, events, store your David Blaine in there, what have you. And an example of the process of that, you have one of these little control rooms or overview rooms at the end there, the state it was when it was inherited. And this gives you a little glimpse into the process that we went through. There wasn't much high tech about it. It was a case of looking at every single junction, every single material, and coming to a decision about what should be done about it, and agreeing with the heritage officers how the thing should be restored or replaced, and then how that looks inside there today. Residential, particularly challenging as it had butted the external facades. Again, we were uncompromising. We had to meet modern environmental criteria for these spaces, but they were lined up against the exterior facades of the building, as well as being located on the top. The strategy was twofold. So where there were new elevations, the facades were incredibly environmentally controlled. Where they abutted the heritage facade, compromises were acceptable so long as the apartment as a whole met all the energy use criteria. So again, understanding first what the existing masonry that it was to do, what was going to happen to the existing facades and the existing masonry. It had to be retained, repaired, and any alterations to be indistinguishable from the original. And that was a substantial portion of the external envelope of the building. So there was a huge process which involved going and finding the original bricks. I think they were called the golden brown pressed bricks from the 1930s, made by a company called Northwick Bricks, owned by a cousin of Winston Churchill, incidentally. The family company was amazingly still going. So they were bought. And over the course of the project, they provided 1.3 million new handmade bricks for the restoration. And that's just for the 1930s half. You'll also see the images there on the left, that the facade in the top left-hand corner was not conducive to residential going in there, the lack of windows. So in actual fact, we actually carried out quite a lot of cutting to the facade, introducing new windows. And we were fairly unapologetic about doing that when it was agreed with the heritage officer, but it was done in a way that was very sympathetic to Gilbert Scott's approach, these long vertical slots and the language of the building. And some images there of the final results. And really, the casual visitor, apart from the glazed additions on the top, you'd be hard pressed to understand what was new, what was restored, what was replaced as part of that. Those are all brand new, double glazed, high performance windows within, quite often a mix of new and old brick facades. And this photo was taken shortly after completion, where you can just about look, depending on the quality of monitor, you can see the difference between the existing bricks and the new additions that were put in order to achieve the opening. But I promise you, if you were to look now, you will be hard pushed to spot that seam. And up on the roof, where there are new facades, as I say, there were highest performance and there were no compromises on the criteria there. But we were keen as well that when you're inside, that you knew you were inside that building. You had a connection to that facade. So, you know, the exposure to the external brick facade was also carried onto the interiors and the residential component, and really did a lot to set the language and the tone for the interior design of the residential units, which, given the quirkiness of the building, there's, I think, 250 apartments within this building and very little repetition. So a nightmare to do, to be blunt. But again, well, on that facade, we then had to do a lot of condensation calculations to demonstrate that we weren't going to get thermal bridging problems, condensation issues, all the rest of it. So a lot of proving out had to be done that that the performance of the apartments in the rooms was not compromised. Similarly, residential lobbies, the ruination became very much the theme. You can see the original cut steel structure there, featuring on the wall old slabs, all left, made safe, cleaned up, but generally left as was. One of the beams that had to be removed from elsewhere of the building being repurposed as a rather funky reception desk. So as much as possible, light touch, understanding the building you're in, not putting a gloss on it, just making it work as new. Coming onto the office area here, at the time we designed it, it was a speculative office area. We didn't know who the tenant was going to be. When Apple announced that they were taking the entire thing, that obviously opened up a whole wealth of opportunities in terms of the overall environmental strategy for the building. They brought Foster's with them to do the fit out. They'd just come along from Cupertino, where they'd done that wonderful building out in California for Apple. And we worked together with Foster's to ensure that the internal environmental strategy was as green as it could be as well. So it is a single use, so the atrium could really be put into service as part of a mixed mode, as fast as possible natural ventilation strategy. So a low energy environmental strategy inside the reused building. And actually, in reconstructing that one wall, which you remember from before, the one that collapsed, using the latest technology. So really building large modern methods of construction, sort of modular panels off-site in a factory to really reduce the amount of crane time, hook time, the need for scaffolding on the facade, and lift it in there. So again, when you go there now, looks like the original power station is actually built with absolutely the latest technological innovations. And inside, which I don't have many pictures of because this is Apple's space and they're quite sensitive about these sort of things. But again, that connection to these long vertical slot windows, and you're really aware of the building that you're in, and it's very, very characterful as a result. And the fit out by Foster's was very complementary to that. Some images of the final result on the exterior. So what you're looking at there is actually brand new chimneys, because they had to be replaced. A mixture of old existing bricks that are cleaned up, new bricks which have been added in, brand new high-performing windows, and new additions on the top. So it's a little bit George Washington's axe, but it's very interesting what had to be done in order to bring this building back to life and to be true to itself. And we actually had to negotiate a lot of things on a case-by-case basis with the heritage officer as to what was the right thing to do right by the building. And an image there of the final result. So the final one I wanted to touch on, I think I'm doing all right for time, was 63 Madison Avenue. So this was a competition that we took part in with Eckersley O'Callaghan back in 2020. And what was interesting about this was we were exploring strategies for updating the facades, reusing the existing structure as much as possible for a 1960s office building, 63 Madison Avenue in New York. And, you know, I don't think it's unfair to sort of say, looking at this, it was a reasonably unremarkable building. And what we thought was interesting about this was precisely that unremarkable character of it, because many other buildings that we're looking at trying to give a reuse to and might previously have considered demolishing, what can you do to repurpose them and really give them a new lease of life without bringing them back down to ground level? And our response with this, we called Second Skin. Again, working very closely with Eckersley O'Callaghan, and what can you reskin and overlay over the building as a strategy? So this shows the building in its context, and I think just really highlights the character of the building in its context, exposed on 3 sides to streets, its 4th side of the party wall, effectively. And the solution we came up to is we called the adaptive net. The idea was to create a strategy that would respond, you could overlay over the building and would respond to the unique environmental characteristics that happened on any given point of the facade, and also develop a solution that could be applied anywhere. So the general approach was to reduce carbon emissions of the building in operation, but also preserve the embodied carbon, both by preserving as much of the existing building as possible, but being as lightweight as possible in terms of what we added on. So in terms of the design drivers for the facade, we identified a series of criteria. So solar radiation, sunlight hours, exposure to wind, air quality, close proximity to the street, effectively what that means, the amount of noise, the acoustic criteria, wellness things, so such as where are the good views, where are views to local green spaces, and overlaying those on the facade to understand in any given point what the criteria for the design were. And then that adaptive net would effectively have elements within it that would respond to each one of those criteria. And the drivers were to be simple, cost-effective, and adaptive. So facilities were provided, such as light shelves, planting, balconies acting as acoustic baffles or shading elements, and they were sort of placed to counter the pre-mentioned sort of environmental drivers. The net itself was a fairly simple tensile system of lightweight cables supported off the building's existing primary frame. The shelter, we were also very keen that the additional zone also created various spaces to sort of break out, make the intermediate zone occupiable. So new terraces, Juliet balconies, breakout spaces were all possible. The idea was that it could become an inhabitable facade as well. It also, the addition of the external space, the external net, I should say, allowed us to adapt the internal skin as well. So the internal, previously single glazed curtain walling with large sort of solid spandrel panels, was replaced with a high performance curtain walling system with additional glazing. So additional light, natural light could be brought in with solar control being carried out by that external skin. So that became possible to really do as much as possible to improve the internal environment. That meant we could lift ceilings, expose surfaces, and let that effect ripple into the workspaces themselves. The landscaping scheme as well was thought about. We thought that different parts of the facade would have different planting strategies because effectively they would have different ecosystems, ecological sort of drivers at each point. So some areas where it was overshadowed would be cool and dark, a sort of a woodland edge type environment. Some areas would get seasonal, nearly light around, but in winter would suffer, but in summer would receive light. And some areas were really quite exposed. So the planting strategy was also developed to reflect the local biophilia of the original island of Manhattan that lay beneath our feet and the particular points on the facade of the building. And, the final result, we thought, what we really liked about it as well is that it gave it an entirely new look. It's deliberately pop, if you like, deliberately colorful. It's a radical sort of rethink with a minimal intervention. So we thought it was a really interesting sort of experiment about how, with the lightest of touch, you could really bring what was previously a rather unremarkable building back to life. Sadly, this competition we won just as COVID started. So as yet, it hasn't rolled forwards. But if any of you are listening have a similar type building that could need this treatment, give me a call. So to conclude, as I think that's my 45 minutes just about up, some food for thought there. Look, in a low carbon world, retention is not always appropriate, but it is becoming the default and we rarely have a blank slate. The last thing I wanted to do with this talk was to say that I would try and give a conclusive answer, but to maybe sort of say that there are some merits in a flexible approach and it's always possible to achieve something. And that working with existing fabric means character in our view, not compromise. It is a constraint, it drives the design, absolutely. It takes you to places you didn't necessarily think you were going to go at the outset, but the result is invariably, we think, a more characterful and better building for that process. And it's always worth working with the unremarkable. Two of my examples there were heritage buildings that probably, if they hadn't been heritage buildings at that time, they may well have just been demolished and replaced with housing or whatever the driver was at the time. But it is worth working with our unremarkable buildings as well. This here is a 1980s office building we worked on in the City of London, given a new lease of life, new accommodation, new performance with, again, fairly light touch. Always worth working with the unfashionable because tastes change. And being flexible about retention and modification is, I think, important. Maintaining that dialogue with heritage officers, all stakeholders, being flexible, all stakeholders, I think is the best way to get the best results. And you've got to make sure that when you're going in, you're doing right by the building. But that doesn't necessarily mean preserving it in aspect and not changing anything. And something that I wish my children would learn, I think final conclusion, respect the old, but don't be afraid of change. And there I shall leave it. So thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you, Ed. If you want to unshare your screen, that would be great. And thank you for a fabulous presentation, 3 incredible projects, and really lovely to see the inclusion, as you mentioned, of the unfashionable, unremarkable, because I think, that's often where the challenge lies in terms of, I guess, making the case for adaptive reuse over demolition. In terms of that, I guess one of the things that often comes up on those projects is, clients provided with a cost plan that says that, to adapt it, it will cost X. And inevitably the question is asked, well, if we knocked it down and rebuilt it, what would that cost? How do you deal with that? Any suggestions for dealing with that conversation? How do you help make that case? Sometimes it's easier when it's a heritage building because, people can see the intrinsic value.
It's a very difficult question, right? I mean, especially in the context of Battersea Power Station, which we were talking about there, the scale of the unknowns and the scale of the discovery there meant that the initial cost plan was only ever going to be a guide. And it was notable, and we were all acutely aware going into that just how many big players and developers, what have you, the project had effectively broken. So look, there is no easy answer to that. Retention does contain a larger degree of unknowns. That said, I think the scale and the unusual scale of Battersea Power Station, it's a complete outlier in that way. I would say there is additional value that can be derived from restoring old buildings and reusing buildings as well. It shouldn't be necessarily seen as the cheap alternative. Obviously, if you're reusing structure and reusing foundations and those sorts of things, there is a sort of potentially a cost saving there as well, even though it then introduces quirks and processes into the building and more unknowns and things that you're going to discover. So there is a sort of a balancing act there. Quite often when we're doing reuse of existing buildings, it isn't necessarily the appearance of the building or the external skin we're looking to use. It can just be the superstructure or the slabs or the concrete, etc. And in those situations, I think that is starting now to be fairly well understood as a cost model. And there are reasonable assumptions that you can go into that with. But you need a very good QS on your side, and you need everybody to go in there with absolute open eyes about what you can and can't achieve, and just accept that you will have discovery along the way. I don't know if that answers your question, because I don't know necessarily there is an easy answer, but I would say that most buildings are not Battersea Power Station in that regard.
No. And I suppose we're almost out of time, but I guess, you made the point at the start that, change is coming, that there's likely to be changes in the regulatory environment within Australia. That means that, it'll be increasingly difficult to make the case for demolition, which is a good thing. What is your suggestion to practices, particularly maybe small and medium-sized practices? How do they upskill themselves to be able to deal more effectively with adaptive reuse projects? What would be your...
That's a very good question. I mean, in a way, I guess the DNA of a lot of smaller practices have probably come from that background anyway. A lot of practices start, with a residential where you're working with existing houses. So in a lot of ways, I imagine that's something that is already in their DNA and in their background. And it isn't necessarily anything to be afraid of when upscaling. Hesitate to say there's no magic in it, because obviously we put ourselves forward as experts in doing that sort of thing. But I think all I would say is it's about an openness and a flexibility and approach and doing right by the building. And I think most architects by instinct want to do that anyway. And I think you learn by doing. I don't think there's a magic CPD or a pithy response I can give now in 30 seconds that will open the window on that. It is the way the industry is going, and architects are nothing if not adaptable creatures. I fundamentally believe that. So it is something that we're going to be doing more of. And I think I look at the industry in Australia, and I have no doubt, no lack of confidence in the ability to really sort of step up to this sort of new environment that we find ourselves in, because I think it's where a lot of the practices here have come from.
Yep. No, that's an excellent point. All right. Well, we might leave it there. I'd like to thank everybody for joining, and just a reminder that these lean-ins are recorded to view later, and you can receive notifications of when new lean-ins are available to view by subscribing to the Australian Institute of Architects YouTube channel, YouTube at Oz Architects. And finally, thank you again, Ed, so much for your time and your generosity in presenting today, and also thank you to the Institute for organising the infrastructure for this. And have a great day.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.